Lewis let Mercedes know later how he felt about being left on the medium tyre. And what was fascinating, I was in the mix zone on Sunday. So once the drivers are done with the TV pen, they come and talk to us in the written media. Usually we're next to the TV pen. We're actually kind of tucked
Okay.
away, like in the middle of nowhere for this. But Lewis came to us and he'd calmed down a lot since, but what he said at the time was the reason that he didn't make the same call as George was it was fascinating. George was saying, I don't feel great on this tyre. I really don't like it. Put me on the softs. Lewis wasn't feeling that. Lewis had been really quick on that in that little spell when that tyre had gone on. And he felt great. And he did not realize that switching onto the softs was going to be something he did or that he had the option to do really until he drove past the Mercedes pit box. And obviously all the mechanics are stood there with those red tyres. And Lewis thinks, oh, well, clearly they're for George. And he knows that Max has stopped as well. So I think that Lewis suddenly realized that this great opportunity to at least fight Max properly had gone. He swore at Mercedes a few times on the radio.
Mhm.
And I mean, just as a side note, my favorite one-liner of the season came out from that when that evening, Toto Wolff said about being shouted out on the radio. He said, we were basically like vomit bags for these drivers or trash. I think he said trash bins as well. He's like, we just have to take it. And I thought it's such a good way of describing radio messages because I often have to tell people like, yeah, they do sound whiny on the radio, but they're doing quite a lot. They're driving these big speeds. They're driving, very dangerous cars. They're losing all this weight. They're kind of dehydrated sometimes, and they don't know the bigger picture that we can see on TV. And that was definitely the case with Lewis. And I think one of the great things about Lewis that is compelling, and it's the same with Max as well, is, so passionate about winning, just so driven to win. So I think when he was doing that, that's what that came from. But yeah, obviously the restart, we were super excited about the restart when the safety car came out. I will admit, people in the media center were kind of G'd up by that because it'd been so deflating with the virtual safety car. The second safety car, you thought, oh well, this maybe this resets things and maybe it gives us some kind of race. But obviously, Max just kind of flew past Lewis. An interesting side note from that, which Lewis admitted, was as he came around the final corner, he was briefly in the wrong mode. They have obviously different engine modes, and he pushed the wrong one. He said it didn't have a huge impact on the restart, but I think at that point you can see how it would have changed his trajectory out of that corner. Max flies past him and he's never seen again, and Lewis kind of slips down to fourth. And clearly, if had the decision been different from Mercedes, I think they could have had both cars on the podium. But at the same time, I don't know. It is interesting that George made that call and Lewis didn't, and also that Mercedes hadn't thought about it. But I think Toto Wolff's rationale later for that was they chose the call that went for the win rather than settling for the podium, and I think that's quite a good mindset to have. It shows they're still in that championship mindset. They were like, well, let's go for it. We've got nothing to lose here. Maybe it was the wrong call in hindsight, but yeah, I don't know. It definitely felt like we were robbed of a really great finish a couple of times during the finish, like with the virtual safety car, then with the pit call mistake. And yeah, I think all of us are just we remember last year so fondly that Max and Lewis. I mean, I was there like this. Yeah, we're going to get Max v Lewis in Zandvoort. I was convinced that Lewis was going to be like, if he had the lead into turn one and Max was coming around the outside, he's going to be like, look, I'm not letting you pass me here. I remember what you did last. I remember how we fought last year. So yeah, it could have been so great, and we didn't get to see it. But pretty dramatic stuff still, and a great case of what might have been.
I understand, obviously, the mindset wanting to go for the win, and that's fine and good. But I think from Lewis's standpoint, Laurence's, he would have liked George to have stayed out with him because, yes, Max Verstappen might have probably won that race regardless and passed both of them. But at the restart, Max Verstappen would have had to overtake George Russell before getting to Lewis Hamilton. And there we could have seen that battle. And instead, there was no buffer between Lewis and Max because George had pitted at that point to go for the soft. So do you feel like Lewis's frustrations are warranted, or in that moment, that's just going to be a dramatic debrief in the Mercedes garage after?
There's a few things going on there, and Mercedes had their reasons for pitting George. And actually, I know it sounded like George made the call and all that kind of stuff, but Mercedes were actually thinking about that with both cars as they were coming in, and then they decided to go with George. Now, the reason they said they did that, because you're right, having a buffer there presumably would have at least protected him for one lap. It may have done more. But one was the split strategy. So you have best of both. Hopefully one of them's going to work out. The other one is that they were hopeful that Lewis would be able to hold off Max in the first lap. Again, I think that engine mode setting that Nate talked about was significant. That was one of the reasons why Max was so far past Lewis so early in the straight. So had Lewis been able to hold him off into turn one, you then would have had George behind Max on soft tyres. And we saw through the race that the Mercedes was pretty good on, in certain parts of the race, it was pretty good. It was up there on the pace of the Red Bull. So they were hopeful that by having George on soft tyres behind, he could make Max's life difficult and give Lewis more of a chance to get away. I think the reality was that on those softer tyres, and, I think they kind of slightly misjudged how good the medium tyres that Lewis only had 5 racing laps on. So that was part of their thought process, but they misjudged how good they would be. And I think Lewis would have dropped back anyway. But there were reasons behind it. But they said, another reason for this was that they sat down in the pre-race briefing on what they're going to do with strategy. All the teams do it on a Sunday morning. And they said, look, if we end up in a situation late in the race, we know we've got good race pace. Do we take gambles on track position? Do we take it on tyres? What do we do? And, they felt at a track like Zandvoort, where it's quite difficult to overtake. Certainly last year's race told us that it was very difficult to overtake last year. Then, let's try and prioritize track position, even if it's a big risk. And so that's what, they went for. And Lewis was on board with that in the morning. I think when he then dropped 3 places in the space of a few laps, he wasn't quite so on board with it, understandably. But that's why it kind of came about. So, we've hit Ferrari pretty hard when they've made mistakes like this, but it's also a completely different mindset, because Mercedes aren't fighting for this championship. Sure, they could potentially get second place, but at one stage Ferrari were really fighting for the championship. And in those situations, you go conservative and you bank your points and you take your second and third, which would have been pretty much nailed on if they're pitted both Lewis and George for softs. And they might have even got first by, being able to attack Max at the end. But in that situation, they gambled everything on a race win. And look, if they got it, they would look like absolute heroes. But like we've seen other teams do this year, especially Ferrari from time to time, they just misjudged how good the tyres they had on the car were. And, the opportunity slipped away. But I can see why they did it. And I don't really, I'm not really surprised they did it. And also I don't really hold it against them. I don't think it was a huge error. I think it was just trying everything to get that win on the board that they haven't got yet this season.
And also on the Mercedes-Ferrari comparison, I actually tweeted shortly before all hell broke loose at Zandvoort. I said that that race was quite a good example of why last year was such a good and tight fight, and this year hasn't been. I think operationally, if you look at what Mercedes do, if you ignore the call that we're talking about, but to put themselves in that position, Mercedes have been fantastic all weekend. If you look across the board, drivers, strategy, pit stops, they're so good this year, and obviously the car isn't quite there. When you look at Ferrari, they're just lacking in every area. The drivers are making small errors, the team's making small errors, as we'll get onto. The pit crew are making errors. Like everyone's just kind of, the errors are kind of recycling. So I think Mercedes more often than not this year have got it right. Whereas with Ferrari, I think we give them a hard time because it started off as 1 or 2 mistakes, and then it just became, every race Ferrari's doing something. So I think that's probably why. But I did think that. I did wonder what would have happened collectively to all of our brains if Ferrari had done that, and I don't think we'd all have survived long enough to have done this podcast. So so I'm glad it wasn't them. We at least had some sanity to bring into the week.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube, and for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app, and for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.